Cybersecurity, approaching the problem differently, taking a patient safety lens on cybersecurity resilience. So this is going to be an interesting session. I see Abigail is stepping to the stage with her panelists. This is going to be an interesting session. Abigail Carter-Langford is Executive Vice President of Governance, Risk, Compliance, and Chief Privacy Officer at Canada Health Infoway, and will always has exciting and interesting things to say, and I'm sure her panelists will do the same. And so, Abigail, over to you, and thank you. And I'll take
Thank you, but I was planning on setting the bar low. The one promise I made to folks out in the outside was, I promise we won't talk about it in the usual way, because I think anytime you go to one of these events, how am I doing, Rita? Is the mic doing okay? It's grumpy? All right, let me try that again. Is that better? All right. I gotta face it. Okay, that's gonna be a problem for me because I turn too much. I also should warn you, I'm a bit like the other Abby from Infoway, honorary Newfoundlander status thing, so I'll work on that. But a big thank you for having some time for us today. And we do want to have a very different conversation around cybersecurity and cybersecurity risk, because I'll be honest, I don't think I can sit up for another 45 minutes and have the usual conversation. So already it's been a bit different today. We've talked about how cybersecurity and addressing it differently and collaborating together is an important piece of the interoperability puzzle. And we want to continue having that different conversation. Because we usually talk about the problem of cybersecurity in healthcare. And I don't think I need to tell anyone in this audience that that's a very real problem. And it's problem probably because criminals understood the value of our health data far before we as a sector understood the value of that data. And what that means is that we are, and it depends on the report you read, we're either the most targeted sector of any sector, or yesterday in a Canadian cybersecurity report, we fell to number 2. So we're laughing at those poor infrastructure folks, but there's 12 folks who are feeling better than we are in healthcare. So it's a real challenge. And we have an opportunity often to stare at that problem, but what we have less of an opportunity to do is get together in a room like this and talk about what makes it unique in healthcare and how can that be a pathway to doing things differently. So I was good and nervous about this because this is a packed room, and I thought the only way I'm going to compensate for that nervousness was to bring some friends. So that's what I've done here today. And we're going to talk a little bit about those challenges. And we're going to talk about it in a way that focuses on trying to meaningfully understand what's the impact to patients, what's the impact to clinicians of this cybersecurity challenge we're facing, because there are these uniquenesses in healthcare. We had a good conversation this morning about how the value proposition of information in healthcare is actually about getting that data out. Getting that data out to patients, getting that out to clinicians, getting that out to health system planners. And that presents a different picture than other industries. If we were in banking, we'd be having a very different conversation. But that's also an opportunity. So we want to ask the question today, how we continue with all that good preventative technology work, but how do we recognize that in healthcare this is a human problem, not just a technology issue? So I read a piece in September that horrified me, but it was fascinating, and it was a report out of the Ponemon Institute in the States. And what they got their hands on was this piece of data. And it's not a piece of data, it's a lot of data. And what they looked at was organizations that had had a significant cyber event, and 20% of those organizations correlated one of those big 4 types of attacks to a material increase in their patient mortality. 1 in 5 of those hospitals had an increase in patient mortality that they could tie to a cybersecurity event. And that is, I'll be honest, I find that a bit terrifying, but there's also an opportunity in that. So when we think about ransomware, we're not thinking just about losing access to data, we're thinking about test delays, we're thinking about increased inpatient stays, and those are the kind of impacts that we know we can't tolerate in our current environment. So if the problem is different, the beauty of this is the opportunity is different as well. Because when I hear that, I hear, okay, this isn't about data anymore. I can stop using that word. Because it's not just about privacy either, it's about patient safety, and that changes everything. So as I said, I brought some friends. So these are folks like a good cup of tea.
Alors, tout ceci est vraiment imbu de soins de première ligne d'abord et avant tout. Et Trevor est au bout là et bon, on pense à eux en tant que personne, mais pas souvent comme titre. Mais vice-président, risque de santé et gestion, bon, sécurité de santé et gestion des risques, Healthcare Insurance Reciprocal of Canada, et Amelia Hoyt, qui est dirigeante principale de l'information Hôpital Michael Garen. Donc, j'aimerais que vous me parliez un petit peu de votre point de vue, votre entrée en matière dans ce domaine. Merci.
So as Abby said, I'm the Vice President of Healthcare Safety and Risk Management, and joined here today by other great colleagues such as Amar Lachman and Kopia Nathan in the audience. HEROC really is a leader in medical malpractice insurance, and what that means is we help hospitals and healthcare providers with complex situations, specifically in times of need, such as patient safety issues. One thing that hopefully you'll take away today is that cyber is a patient safety issue. It's absolutely 100% emerged. It's not emerging, and it is a patient safety issue. And I think the other key important thing from being on the front lines coast to coast supporting when these things happen is if you take away anything, it's this idea of never be uncertain alone. So what we do each day can be mitigated in the moment by having collaborations and conversations. And I think really today is just a huge thank you again for having the opportunity to have that committed conversation in the moment. But thank you.
So if I can digress for a minute, our friendship started in an airport when I was kind of bracing myself because we kept going into rooms because Infoy's been talking a lot with folks in quiet rooms about this problem to try to attack it differently as a community. And what I kept hearing was about, oh, no, we've got to be quiet about this. This can't be an open room conversation. So I was kind of bracing myself and I was like, well, I'm going to call the insurer. And what I didn't expect is for you to say exactly that. A completely different message than keep it in the back room. So thank you for saying it. And Amelia.
I want to echo what Trevor and Abigail said, that it's great to be here to talk about a topic that actually has been really swept under the rug often. Folks usually don't want to talk about when an organization has a cybersecurity incident. So I'm going to just take a little bit to tell you about kind of our case study at Michael Garen. So Michael Garen Hospital, just for context, so we're a community hospital that's based about 5 kilometers from downtown Toronto. We serve a very diverse population. We have about 400,000 folks who live in our catchment area, 50 plus languages. It's very diverse, lots of newcomers, and we officially have about 22 identified diverse neighborhoods. So as you can imagine, it's a very complex population that we serve. So Michael Garen in the fall of 2019, unfortunately was hit with a major ransomware attack. So it was a Ryuk ransomware, and it infiltrated, as you can imagine. Someone clicked on an email link, and it caused a full shutdown of every system in our hospital. It caused us to rebuild our entire server farm, and it didn't help that we still had a lot of physical servers at the time. And there were some silver linings from that, as you can imagine. It allowed us to improve our infrastructure, but unfortunately, it was a reactive reaction instead of something being proactive. And I think that Trevor talked a lot about collaboration, and we only actually got out of that ransomware attack because of collaboration with our peers within the GTA in order to be able to get out of that. We had such an impact to patient safety, as Abby said, because we had our main HIS, which is Cerner, was down for a week, and so we went to full paper during that time. And so, as much as we all have downtime processes, that because we live in this hybrid world, you think about the new staff who actually have never really known a paper world versus those who may have, and when those worlds collide, that actually causes even a higher level of risk, right? And so, that's another discussion we can probably talk about. So I guess I just want to end, and we'll talk further, but really I think that at the time, I think everyone knew about our incident, and if you didn't, you can Google it. It's all over CBC and all over the news. I would say that I don't know how many of you know about subsequent incidents since then. And it shouldn't be like that, because I think that, as Trevor said, we actually need to share more so we can learn from one another and actually be able to not reinvent the wheel when we need to actually increase our ability to reduce these incidences without being reactive.
When we talked about having this conversation here, you talked a lot about the lasting impacts of it. Like that was not, and I think often as well we have this conversation about a cyber event as if the event stops when you clear out the ransomware. You've already talked about needing to rebuild everything. Are you done? Is it over?
I mean, I don't think anyone ever can be done. Yeah, you referenced, data being such a hot asset, like in healthcare, but certainly in all industries, right? We know that ransomware, those actors already know that, and they target for a reason. They know that there's financial gain for them to have. And so I think that we all need to be ahead of the curve instead of kind of behind. And unfortunately, like I think over the years, we've had to learn the hard way. And so I think that, some of the outcomes from our incident, of course, we rebuilt all our infrastructure. From a board level, there's been a renewed interest and priority setting at that level in terms of investment. But I think that that's too much. There's only so much we can do at a local level. Like this is something that really needs to expand much more broadly. So within the province and nationally, which is what we're here to talk about today. This morning we heard a lot about interoperability and data and sharing. And with that actually increases the risk profile every day in everything that we do, right? So, I represent health information as a health information custodian. I do worry about that. Like I worry about how we put the right protective measures in place to ensure that we're, owning up to those principles that we signed up for as a HIC. And I don't know if I think there's always room for improvement, right?
Yeah.
And I think part of it is education, like back to the email piece, like literally, we all know, don't click on the email that looks suspicious, but they're very good at being able to trick you. And then, I look at like my parents aren't very savvy, and we have a population that may not be as diligent in kind of thinking through. So not only is there education within our own organizations, but it's with the general population to understand what risks that they are encountering when they're dealing with these actors.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned education and how we do that. I think the human element is key. So everybody here, raise your hand if you've made a mistake in your life. Anyone? There always is one humanoid robot in the room, so we're looking for that one. But okay, and so we make mistakes. That's human. How do we design for those systems, and what behaviors can we take away from that? I think is the way forward. The risk profile is interesting, is that hospitals and healthcare organizations, whenever we go to boards across the country and we have conversations saying, you know what, in my industry as banking, no, it's the same. There's risks everywhere. Healthcare is one of these really unique things where you just can't turn it off. It's 24/7. There's real life to it. And I think that's something interesting around how you're designing these systems. So going back to paper is great, but how often do we fully go back to paper, and how do we do that, and for how long? I think the other important thing that you're saying is you can't always let risk stop what's right either. And I think that's the important piece of why this talk today, if you root on this, is around patient safety. And within patient safety, regardless of whatever theory or what decade we're in, it's really about this concept of action. So all of us know the different theories that are out there. We know how to design these things. We know it's expensive to rebuild things, and we have all these different things in place. But do we know what steps or what principles to take forward? And I think that's really interesting what you're saying, is that, you know what, we had this incident, but do you know about the other ones we had? And right now, someone in this room is having an incident, if they know about it or not. And are we open to share it, and are we open to talk about it? And I think, much like the patient safety pieces, is we don't talk about these things. Death by suicide while under care, that happens across the country. Do we talk about that? Do we hear about that? We largely don't, right? It's about airing dirty laundry. Trying to change that conversation in safety is the same thing with what I think you're doing, and admirably doing it within these conversations today for risk in cyber.
So can we spend a moment on that? So I've got an intuitive, especially from our role as InfoWay, belief in the value of sharing and collaborating, and a firmly held belief that as a sector, because again, if we think about this, if we're going to be the most targeted, let's leverage our strengths. And one of our strengths is collaboration. We're not competitors. We have an advantage here. We have an opportunity. So can we talk a little bit about, from both of your perspectives, of where you actually get that value from the sharing? Trevor, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's really in that real-time or near real-time learning. What happens today in Corner Brook, Newfoundland is also happening in Alberta.
Yeah.
Understanding those patterns and how there may be vulnerabilities, I think is a wonderful thing where we can have pieces. The other thing, when we started the conversation about never be uncertain alone, having a colleague to call up and say, hey, this is what's happening, what approaches did you take, or what can you do, is really helpful. Just as a real applied example, a health authority had some malicious interference, and we were able to work with Mealy around sharing learnings from your incident in real time. And I think that collaboration, that connection, really helps to move forward. What did you do? But what are the real questions? And as all leaders, health leaders, cyber leaders, whatever you may be, I think that's really important around what do we have before, what are we doing in the middle, and what can we do after? And I think that's really important.
And I do quite like that about this conversation, because when it comes to cybersecurity events within a realm, we're all on the same footing with the same challenge. So the opportunity there to collaborate, this is not a rural problem, this crosses every line. So that opportunity to get at a table as we've been doing is just a wonderful thing. So what happens if we don't share? Like, can we phrase this in the negative as, what's the impediment?
So I think if we don't share, I think about our incident. I think that we would have taken probably double, triple as long to actually get back to normal operations. So just from a timeline perspective, it actually took us 30 days to get back to normal. And I say normal, our key systems were up, but it actually took probably another 2 months to resolve all of the outstanding issues. And there were actually some systems that we never actually brought back up again. And so we had to find alternatives, and just due to the age. And so this is really also highlighting that in healthcare, we also have maybe some data technology that is really not able to still maintain its currency if something attacks them. And so, with the pressures of the finances that we have, then you have to make hard decisions on how to maintain operations if certain systems are actually at end of life, that are attacked, et cetera. So I think if we didn't have that help from GTA hospitals, like we actually had staff get brought on site, really help us with that, as you said, around call a friend, in terms of expertise that may be elsewhere. I think that we would actually have suffered even further and actually caused more risk to the patients that we serve in our community.
It's an interesting thing, because in this journey, as working collaboratively, we're, as a sector, a little bit behind. And one of the areas that we've been benchmarking and looking at is the energy sector. The energy sector, those processes, the phone a friend is a formalized, well thought out, well constructed network and mesh. So when we think about how do we get faster, get those response times better, get that structure better, one of our colleagues in our security table always reminds us, we don't want that phone call to be during the event. That phone call needs to happen well before the bad thing happens. And it sounds like you used your networks.
We did, and I think that's a really good point, Garen. And I talked a little bit about the reactivity versus proactivity, and I think that as a sector, it's been acknowledged, as we all know, that cybersecurity should be, if not your top priority in your organization. And I think, at least in Ontario right now, that's been recognized by the Ministry of Health. So they have set up now these regional security operations centers, or RSOCs, to really have an umbrella, set up to allow for more sharing and consistency around how security is managed. And really with that comes some funding. And I think that no one has enough, I don't think anyone here would raise their hands and say they have enough money to tackle cybersecurity. Earlier we were talking about health human resources. We also have a shortage of human resources with that expertise in cybersecurity. So I think that we're heading in the right direction in terms of understanding that a scarce resource needs to be shared. You need to leverage the networks that we have in order to really find more efficiencies. And I think the next piece is really, making folks feel comfortable, like moving away from the culture of blame and shame when incidents do happen. And I guess, think about, I think 20 years, I was just thinking about the timeline. So it's 20 years ago, 1999, when the Institute of Medicine's kind of groundbreaking, I'm going to call this groundbreaking report on patient safety was released, right? And you think about how long we've come in this industry to kind of encourage folks to admit, yes, I made a med error. And the reason why we want folks to report that is till we can prevent that from happening. And you can think about it. Back then, you look at the stats, it was flat. No one made med errors in hospitals, and we know that was not true. It's all about reporting and folks feeling that comfort level. And I know today that that is not the case around cybersecurity, right?
Yeah.
Like when incidents happen, even the couple incidents that Trevor mentioned, you maybe heard about it from someone. It's certainly not splashed over the news. I know there's some reasoning behind that to say, well, if it's out in the news, it could potentially trigger other events. When in fact, you know what? I think it's actually better for folks to know about it, so those actors know that actually something's being done about it, right? And I think that, how do we normalize that discussion?
And I think that's so critical around that action. So knowing about something isn't good enough anymore. So I think it's that doing and how do you do it. I think there's another really great piece that you built upon is human error. It's a symptom, it's not a cause. So we can't blame and shame saying, you know what, that person accepted that email. And this was the cause of that. If it was that simple as a cause and effect, then we wouldn't be all here today trying to have these committed conversations on safety. It's complex. And I think that through sharing, and if there's other insurers in the room, you can kick me in the shins after, but I think really don't let that be a reason not to share. I think that there's a lot of conversations, well, you know what, other people are going to duplicate this, or you're opening yourself up to greater liability. The liability exists. By actioning controls, by actioning safety, by moving things forward, you're actually reducing your risk, in my opinion. And you're also working towards your reputation as well of how, you know what, things happen. How do we learn as a system to do this? And I think Canada is wonderfully geographically distant. That's actually an advantage for us. And I think that what's happening in one area is also happening in another area. It has no boundaries. And I think this is how we can learn together.
It's a beautiful thing. So I'm pausing for a second. Oh, I gotta rotate the entire body. So how are we doing? So I see relatively minimal phones, so that's a miracle. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask of these folks? Otherwise, the trouble is I could go all day. Oh, we do one in the back, please. If you holler, so they've asked if you wouldn't mind standing up. You'll holler and then I'll repeat, okay? That's it? That's great. So the question is about taking the patient perspective on this, because we're talking a lot about sharing. How do we allay patients' concerns? And it's kind of an interesting one, because InfoWay's been working with this great team at CAMH. And what they do is take an empirical approach instead of the gut reaction, and they look at what is the impact of issues like this, privacy concerns, on the actions, choices, and trust that patients and clients have in the healthcare system. And one of the things that was a real eye-opener to me when we started looking at this data, and we do that with our benefits evaluation team and the CAMH team, is that we probably don't give our Canadian patient population nearly enough credit. Because what they do is they do the math. They do what a gentleman called Dr. Nelson Shen calls privacy calculus. They do this weighing out of, okay, what's the potential benefit to me of this digital intervention, and what's the risk associated with it? So Canadians, they read the paper. They are not at all unaware of the risk to data. But I think what we see with the consumer demand is they also appreciate the offsetting benefit. So my gut says that Canadians are probably better equipped at having that risk management conversation about digital health than most of us who are sitting back and may not feel the direct benefits of it. So it's an interesting question though, but how do we talk about these things and talk about them in a way that isn't about scaring people, but is in fact about getting better?
I think from my perspective, we have obviously lots of patients or guardians, those who make requests for patient information at our hospital, like all hospitals. And it's about the education around how data is stored today. And I think you have to start from the ground up, that they must actually have to realize that there's still actually a lot that's manual. And although one may think that that's more secure. And I think it was maybe the other Abby, he talked about faxing.
Yeah.
And all of us know that faxing is actually not secure. And there are many reasons for that.
Yeah.
And I think that, just even having that discussion and then kind of transitioning it to, well, there's data that's on paper, there's data that's actually discrete and digital, and how the hospital or any organization actually manages it. So I take it with any kind of approach that I would just around educating folks about digital and technology in general. And I think from there, I think being open about where we do have risks and not, and back to our discussion about not hiding anything. So I think we're bringing, patients are our partners now. That's how we empower them. They need to be part of this discussion as well, like no different than designing a pathway of care, how they're involved with, expanding our healthcare integration and population health. So I think that this is something that has not happened, actually, right?
No, I think those are great case studies. I love your question, and I think that's the responsibility we have. In my field of study is human factors, and that's designing for people and complexity and all kinds of things. I think that, as Amelia was mentioning, is having that understanding, I think, is critical. So transparency, I think, is wonderful. Having good proof of concepts or collaborating to see how other people did it. One thing that we've worked on in partnership with the University of Toronto is, can we use virtual reality or other technologies to help predict dementia or other health-related outcomes? So as using gamification technique, I can ride my bicycle around France while never leaving my hospital room. And at the same time, can I predict if I have delirium, dementia, urinary tract infection, or different things based on that? Why I bring that example up is one of the conversations we had is, are we able to design facial recognitions for older adults? And why that's important is that can reduce having an aide help set them up on the equipment. They can come in, they can log into their settings. But that comes with, I think, a risk conversation from a hospital perspective too, is where is the data being stored? Do you consent to it? What happens if it gets out? And I think all of these conversations come down to what is the value and what's the comfort of people. But I think as good designers, we have that responsibility and that accountability to have these conversations by collaborating, by talking what's working, to design actual technology that works for us as humans. So I think that's a fantastic question, and I encourage all of us to continue to share and to collaborate around those important issues.
It's an interesting one because it reminds me of, we had a session out in Newfoundland and Labrador before the pandemic, and we brought in a really diverse group of folks because we were talking about consent and digital health. What do we need to tell folks? How do we need to tell them? And we were diving down. There was a good number of privacy folks in the room, and from time to time we can find our way to the rabbit hole. Perhaps you've been there with us. And we were having a conversation about all the risks you need to tell patients about. And bless her heart, there was a woman from one of the commissioner's offices there, and she raised her hand and she said, yeah, that's all good, but you seem to have forgotten to also talk about the benefits. And I think that's part of the conversation here, is how do we have a balanced, plain language, non-theoretical conversation about this? Because we don't put out a big old long notice that talks about why a fax machine wouldn't meet any security study known to man today. It just happens, but we put a certain degree of scrutiny on new additions to the system. So how do we achieve a balance of that is an interesting conversation I think we need to have. And how do we do it in an equitable way that makes that conversation accessible to all patients? Because if you're overly reductionist about this, it just equals technology is bad and scary, and we can be a little more smart than that, I think. So I'm risking getting on the soapbox. I'm going to take a little look. Please.
What's your advice for clinics and hospitals on building their contingency plan if they do get attacked? You talked about legacy systems being things down and moving things offline and putting it back up. What will be your advice?
Do you mind repeating the question before?
Yes. So the question was about what would be some advice for clinics, hospitals, in terms of what would the response be if they were attacked, or how to prevent attacks. So I think part of it is, we hear about this, but like doing the education and table talks internally to really remind folks about the different ways that threat actors can really enter your organization. And, I already said this earlier, but the emails, it seems so simple. But certainly that is the top way of getting in. And it's still crazy to think that the main way of how someone enters one's organization. And I think that it does need to normalize that it should just be like a one-off email that CIO sends, during Cybersecurity Month, which was last month, which in October. And, I think that this actually has to become similar to all the healthcare organizations that do their daily huddles, do your daily safety checks and calls, that what are the risks today and how are you dealing with it at a local level? So it's not just the kind of like Christmas or Hanukkah, you talk about it once a year and it gets put away, right? Because that's really what happens right now. It's not part of your daily discussion, just like patient safety. Like if we draw the analogy, patient safety wasn't part of our natural discussion when we were delivering care 20 years ago. And so I use that as an analogy because I think that resonates with people. So the other piece is that every organization does really need to bring up their foundation to what is a minimum standard today. So I talk about these legacy systems. We all have risks that we do bear that we're aware of. And so I think that it would help to set, provincial, national standards on what is actually a bare minimum. So I do think that it's important to actually set, have those published. And I know
Yes.
InfoWay does a lot of that, but I think it's much more at the operational level that would be really helpful. And I'll expand this to some of the other organizations that I do work with. So my other hat is that I do co-chair a digital steering committee within our Ontario Health team, which is Ontario's way of regionalization, as most of you are probably aware. And, in that space, MGH is actually the big fish in the pond there, whereas in the hospital acute care sector, MGH is actually quite the small organization compared to our peers. And so from a cyber perspective, we actually are very advanced, I'm going to air quote, in our OHT, because when you talk about primary care or a lot of these smaller providers, it's not really their top priority. And unfortunately, it's because of probably a bit of financial constraint. There's less subject matter expertise there. And I think that as a system, we need to make sure that everyone is trying to increase their minimum standard around cybersecurity, because it doesn't help that only the acute care sector is raising the bar of cyber. If the data that we share across the sector is going to an organization that has a lower bar, then we're still increasing our risk. So, I think that that's the other piece, is that you need to also work with your partners, especially we can't move that interoperability agenda forward if we're not addressing this.
So can we talk about that for a brief moment? Because you're pointing to a very healthy reality that's based around the notion of patient centricity. You are integrated to a series of other organizations at different levels. So when we talk about downtime planning, code gray planning for those clinical outages, how does that change when we're now talking about an integrated mesh of providers?
Yeah, it's very complex because we take a lot of the access that we have for granted, right? And we all know that. Digital is an enabler. And I referenced how when we moved to paper, depending on where you are in your career, you may never have seen paper in your career. So how do you bridge that gap when you actually are faced with an incident like a code gray? And I would say that I think we all have room for improvement there. And so you first need to baseline. And I'm actually going through that exercise within our OHT right now, just to get like a digital asset survey out there to see kind of what is everyone using, where are there gaps, and we know that there are gaps, but the other opportunity there was to see what we can share and find more efficiencies on, because if there's an ability to use existing assets, then we should do that. There's no point in reinventing the wheel. And I think the next stage would be is to have all the OHTs then share at that next level, and to be able to, I think, really help the province inform where maybe the hotspots or where are the areas of excellence that we should actually continue to share more broadly, like in Ontario, but beyond Ontario. Yeah.
Oh, please, Anna.
I just wanted to build on what you're saying, just in terms of, doctors out in the community, they don't have the same resources that our acute care settings and our very large organizations do. Is there any appetite you found from, your work within the OHT to kind of partner with the acute care setting and to leverage a lot of what's already, the security apparatus that exists within the acute care setting down to primary care? So, you're not changing their EMR, but you're kind of bringing them under your umbrella.
Yeah. So So I'll just repeat the question. So how can we help organizations like primary care, where their cybersecurity level is much probably less than an acute care setting, and how can we help them, get at least kind of to the level playing field? And I'd say that certainly that's really the intent of having the RSOC actually in place, and that there's what's being done at the provincial level. It's like a big Venn diagram. I think that's actually their main platform, right? Where you have the RSOC at the center, where what is really going to be centralized at a very high level from a governance perspective. There will be the RSOC level, and then there's the local level. And so the idea is that the local level will be able to leverage expertise and assets that is rolled out by the RSOC, and they're looking to the OHTs to actually help enable that. And so we're really just trying to get that assessment done now to see what the appetite would be, but it's still complicated, right? Like even if we just look at e-referral, we're trying to do e-referral in primary care, and there's lots of barriers. So we run into similar barriers just because of the level of technological implementation is actually quite variable, right, across all of primary care.
It's striking to me, we had a conversation this morning about the pressure we're placing on that level of the system. And it would seem to me that a failure would be if our expectation is that a doctor in a small group practice with his clinic manager are going to climb this hill alone. When I think about this cybersecurity and the work to make our sector more resilient, it has to be a sector giving a warm hug, embracing all parties in it. And I think, I'll use a micro example of our procurement work. We did that procurement work with direct partnership with some of the large leaders like the provinces and territories, and then we asked the question of how do we cascade this knowledge to those who don't have direct access? And I think that has to be the question. And part of that, and that's why I'm glad you were the one who stepped forward with the question, Anna, because I think that's also where our vendor community comes into play. Absolutely. We have a cyber community we've built. We met yesterday and Sunday, and the spirit of, I see Adam around, the spirit of willingness in that table to support beyond the borders of an organization, to bring our vendor partners into the fold, to land on those reasonable levels of standard and understand how we embrace and bring forward a community is very clear. Because I think you were very helpful in what you said there, Amelia. You're not good until all of your integrated partners are good, because that is the reality of your experience right now, which certainly at minimum incentivizes you to pull them into the hug.
And I mean, it's really also an analogy of what we're trying to do in healthcare in general, right? Yeah. So let's reduce duplication. We're trying to improve care to our patients, and by doing so, it will shorten time to care delivery. Also, avoid the patient having be the center of all information. How many times does the patient have to repeat their information over and over, and it becomes a broken telephone, and they could miss some information, and that's really not their role. They're coming to us to provide the advice and guidance and have access to the information that they believe that we should have, and it's embarrassing when we may not have it. And I think that, and then back, so I think there's similar lines related to then being that custodian, the health information custodian, that we need to take just as serious a job at that, like being serious at that. And again, I think that people forget about that, and it's not intentional. I think that we sometimes are just buried in our day-to-day and don't really bring that to the forefront. And I think that's why these discussions are good, right? Yeah. It's meant for us to really educate more, as we've already talked about. And I think even like between an insurer and a client, making that an okay discussion to have, right? Like I think that the idea is we're both trying to tackle the risk from different perspectives.
I think it's critical. I think safety is a system issue, right? And I think this is what this conversation is meant today, is never be uncertain alone. To your question earlier too, about what do you do? I think you should know what tools you have at your ready as well to respond. No, it's not the individual physician in the community to make this a partner, but that physician may have other tools within their toolbox too. So reach out to your insurer early, and what conversations do they have? What vendors do you have? Do you have within your phone the instant response that you're going to follow through? Time is critical, much like in a heart attack, time is tissue. When things happen, it's really critical to get collaboration and togetherness immediately. So.
So we're approaching the end of our time, which I have to say, usually folks have a maximum of 45 minutes to enjoy the magic of security, although I've felt more popular in the last 6 months than I have in the 20 years prior. So I'm kind of living it up
being
there.
normalized.
That's it. That's
Being
it.
normalized and people want to talk about it.
But perhaps, so I've heard, we've not been subtle about it. We've talked a lot about not a technology issue, a human issue, a patient safety issue. We've, again, not been subtle about the need to bring that kind of a discipline that we apply to patient safety, that you have a moral obligation to talk about it and to support others and to contribute to a safer system. We haven't talked about the nitty-gritty of how we can actually manage that liability profile differently through the sharing, but you hit on some really good stuff there, Trevor, about liability exists. Now we're talking about recovering, and that's the ultimate way of managing. Is there anything else you'd want folks to walk away from this conversation with?
I think again, thank you for having me. I think the key piece is never be uncertain alone. If you take away anything from my perspective is don't be uncertain alone. These are really important conversations. It's not the zeros and the ones here. These are people's lives that you're dealing with specifically within healthcare. And it's your obligation and your accountability to have those committed conversations regardless of how hard they are. This isn't about blame and shame. This is about psychological safety to speak up. It took healthcare 30 years to do this, and we're still not there. So this isn't going to happen overnight. But I really think that, again, collaboration is the only way to move forward. And again, I think that this really highlights how early conversations really does support the system.
Yeah, I mean, really, I have to echo most of what Trevor already said. I think that if you're in a position to even offer that proactive help, I think that's really what you would need to do. And I see that, like in my role in the OHT, there's a lot of folks who actually just don't even know where to go. And so, being able to create those linkages early and related to both privacy as well. Like we didn't really touch privacy today as much, but I often think back to that analogy about shoving it under the rug. Like we need to move away from that. So I think it's about being more proactive and having this as forefront of digital discussions.
Well, thank you very much. So this is, as Abby shared, an important part of InfoWay's work going forward. We're in a process of understanding where those gaps lie and where we can most effectively place our effort and our resources and our interests. So if there are conversations that this has inspired for you, you want to have more of those conversations, please, I'd ask you to seek me out. I'm going to be over by the sweets table where I live next to the coffee. So come make friends. And I think when in doubt, and I think, well, I'm saying ending early. I think we're about 30 seconds ahead of schedule, but never, if you're a privacy or security person, do you overstay your welcome. So with that, I'm going to thank Amelia and Trevor very much for this conversation, and thanks for folks for having the heads up and the engagement to have it with us.
And thank you to you, Abigail, for organizing this great panel. Cybersecurity experts are coming out of the closet. We like that.